towering over little George. She dropped the bottle of milk and it broke with a smash. Then Grandma started shouting at her from the rooftop, and when she looked up, she saw Grandma's head sticking up through the tiles, and she dropped the bag of groceries as well with a splat. "How about that then, eh, Mary?" Grandma shouted. "I bet you've never seen a hen as big as that before." "But that's George's giant hen, that is." stammered George's mother. "It's George's marvellous hen and I." But how well did you get on the roof?" "I didn't," cackled the old woman. "My feet are still standing on the room." This was too much for George's mother to understand. She just goggled and gaped and looked as she was going to faint. Seconds later, George's father appeared. His name was Mr. Killiecranky. Mr. Cranky was a small man with bandy legs and a huge head. He was the kind of father the easiest person to live with, because even the smallest change got him all worked up about things and really excited. The hen standing in the yard was certainly not a small thing. When Mr. Cranky saw it, he started jumping around as though he'd seen something burning at his feet. "Great heavens!" he cried, waving his arms. "What's this? What's happened? Where'd that come from? It's a giant hen." I did it," George said. "Look at me!" Grandma shouted from the rooftop. "Never mind about the hen. What about me?" Mr. Cranky looked up and saw Grandma. Shut up, Grandma," he said. Didn't seem to surprise him that the old girl's head was sticking up through the roof. It was the hen that excited him. He'd never seen anything like it. But then again, who had? "It's fantastic," said Mr. Cranky, shouting and dancing around and around. "It's colossal. It's gigantic. It's tremendous. It's a miracle. Did you do it, George?" George started telling his father about the magic medicine. While he was doing this, the big brown hen sat down in the middle of the yard and went... Everyone stared at it. When it stood up again, there was a brown egg lying there, and the size of a football. "That egg would make scrambled eggs for 20 people, Mrs. Cranky said. "George," Mr. Cranky shouted, "how much of this magic medicine have you got?" Lots, George said. "There's a big pot full in the kitchen, and this bottle's nearly full." "Come with me," Mr. Cranky yelled, grabbing George by the arm, "and bring that medicine as well. For years and years I've tried to breed bigger and bigger animals. Bigger bulls for beef, bigger pigs for pork, bigger sheep for mutton." So he went to the pigsty first. George gave a spoonful of medicine to the pig. The pig blew snow from out its nose, jumped about all over the place, and then it grew and grew and grew until it was the size of a massive caravan. Then he went to the herd of flying black bullocks that Mr. Cranky was trying to fatten for market. George gave them some of the medicine, and guess what happened? Boom! Whoosh! They all shot up in the air as massive as anything. Then the sheep. He gave a little bit to the sheep, and boom! Massive sheep, 12 foot tall, inside the pen. He gave some to his grey pony, Jack Frost. The pony gambled around and was huge in the end, about the size of an elephant. And finally, just for fun, he gave some to Alma, the nanny goat. With a meh, she was now about the size of a very large caravan. Grandma was up on the high rooftop, and she could see everything that was going on. She didn't like what she was looking at. She wanted to be the centre of attention, and no one was taking the slight bit of notice at her. George and Mr. Cranky were running around and getting all excited about the enormous animals. Mrs. Cranky was washing up in the kitchen, and Grandma was all alone on the rooftop. "Hey, you!" she yelled. "George, get me a cup of tea this minute, you little beast." Don't listen to that old goat," Mr. Cranky said. "She's stuck where she is, and that's a good thing too." "Well, we can't leave her up there, Dad," George said. "What if it rains?" "George!" Grandma yelled. "Oh, you horrible little boy! You're disgusting and a little worm. Fetch me a cup of tea at once. Oh, and a slice of currant cake as well." "We'll have to get her out, Dad," George said. "She won't give us any peace if we don't." Mrs. Cranky came outside, and she agreed with George. She's my mother, she said. She's a pain in the neck. Mr. Cranky replied. I don't care, Mrs. Cranky said. I'm not leaving my own mother sticking up through the roof for the rest of her life. So in the end, Mr. Cranky telephoned the crane company and asked them to send the biggest crane out to the house at once. The crane arrived about an hour later. It was on wheels, and there were 2 men inside of it using the operators. The crane men grabbed onto the roof and put ropes under Grandma's arms, and then she was lifted right up through the roof. In a way, the medicine had done Grandma good. It had not made her any less grumpy or bad-tempered. But it seemed to have cured all of her aches and pains, and she was suddenly as frisky as a ferret. As soon as the crane lowered her to the ground, she ran over to George's huge pony, and jumped onto his back. This ancient old hag, who was now as tall as the house itself, but enough to ride the pony, galloped onto the farm and leapt onto the gigantic pony, jumping over the trees and sheds and shouting, "Our way, clear the decks! Stand back, all of you, you miserable little midgets, or I'll trample you to death!" Yeah, and other silly things like that. Grandma was now too tall to get back inside of the house. She had to sleep that night in the hay barn with the mice and the rats. The next day, George's father came down to breakfast in a state of even greater excitement than ever. "I've been awake all night thinking about it," he cried. About what, Dad?" George asked. "About your mouse. We can't stop now, my lad. We must start making more of it at once. More and more and more." The giant stewing pot had been completely empty the day before because there had been so many sheep and pigs and cows and bullocks to be dosed up with it. "But why do we need more, Dad?" George asked. "We've done all our own animals, and we've made Grandma feel as frisky as a ferret. Even though she does have to sleep." "Ah, dear boy," said Mr. Cranky, "we need barrels and barrels of it. Tons and tons. Then we'll sell it to every farmer in the world, so that all of them can have giant animals. We'll build a Marvellous medicine factory, and we'll sell the stuff in bottles at £10 a piece. We'll become rich, and you, my lad, will be famous." But wait a minute, Dad," George said. "There's no waiting," cried Mr. Cranky, working him so much that he started to put butter in his coffee and milk on his toast. "Don't you understand? This tremendous invention of yours is going to... No one will ever go hungry again." But why won't they?" asked George. "Well, because one giant cow will give 50 buckets of milk a day," cried Mr. Cranky, waving his arms. "One giant chicken will make 100 fried chicken dinners, and one giant pig will give you 1,000 pork chops. It's tremendous, my dear boy. It's fantastic. It'll change the world." But wait a minute, Dad," George said. "Don't keep saying wait a minute," shouted Mr. Cranky. "There isn't a minute to wait. We must get cracking at once." "Do please be calm, dear," said Mrs. Cranky from the other end of the table, "and stop putting marmalade on your cornflakes." "Heck with the blooming cornflakes," said Mr. Cranky, leaping up from his chair. "Come on, George, let's get going, and the first thing we need to do is make one more stew pot as a tester." But Dad," said George, a little nervous now, the trouble is..." "There won't be any trouble, my boy," said Mr. Cranky. "How can there possibly be any trouble? All you've got to do is put the same stuff into pot like you did yesterday. And while you're doing it, I'll write down each and every item, and that's how we..." But Dad," George said, "just listen to me, please." "Why don't you listen to him?" Mrs. Cranky said. "The boy's trying to tell you something." But Mr. Cranky was far too excited to listen to anybody except himself. "And then," he cried, "when the new mixture is ready, we'll test it out on an old hen just to make sure we got it right. And then after that, we'll shout hooray and build the giant factory." "But Dad..." "Come on then, what is it what you want to say then?" "I can't possibly remember all the hundreds of things I put into the pot to make the medicine," George said. "Of course you can, me dear boy," said Mr. Cranky. "I'll help you. I'll jog your memory. Now, you'll get it in the end. You'll see if you don't. Now then, what was the very first thing you put in?" I went up to the bathroom first, George said. I used a lot of thing in the bathroom and in Mubby's dressing table. Come on then, said Mr. Cranky. Up we go to the bathroom. When they got there, they found, of course, a whole lot of empty tubes and empty aerosol cans. And also an empty load of bottles. Oh, that's great, said Mr. Cranky. That tells us exactly what you've used. So if anything's empty, it means you've used it. So Mr. Cranky started making a list of everything that was empty in the bathroom. They went to Mrs. Cranky's dressing table. Right, a box of powder, said Mr. Cranky, writing it down. Helga's hair set, flowers at turnips, perfume. Ah, terrific. This is going to be easy. Where'd you go next? I went into the laundry room, George said. But are you sure I haven't mixed anything in here, Dad? That's up to you, boy. Have I? I don't think so, George said. So down they went to the laundry room. And once again, Mr. Cranky wrote down all the names of all the empty bottles and cans. My goodness me, what a mass of stuff you used, he cried. No wonder it did magic things. Is that the lot? No, Dad, it's not, George said, as he led his father out to the shed where all the animal medicines were. And they were still kept and showing him 5 big empty bottles up on the shelf. Mr. Cranky wrote down all their names. Mr. Cranky said. Little George scratched his head and thought, and thought. But he couldn't remember anything going into the potion. He leapt into his car and drove down to the village and brought new bottles and tubes and cans of everything on the list. Then he went to the vet and got a fresh supply of all the animal medicines that George had used. Now, come on then, lad, show me how you did it. Show me how you mix this medicine and we'll do it together. Okay, so we're approaching the end of the book now, so I hope everyone's enjoying the reading. Also as well, if you feel like pop it down there in the comments and I'll take a look and see if I can get the time for it. Okay, so see you later, folks. Sweet dreams, stay safe, stay clean.